Okay, so I usually start by asking everyone to sort of think about what they're wearing right now. And I like people to kind of like just put a hand on whatever it is that you're wearing or that you have closest to you, and think about what material it is. I think for most people here, they kind of like are familiar with all the different forms of materials, whether it's rayon or cotton. And I want you to think about all of the people who've touched your garments. The people who made them, who sewed them, who folded them, who displayed them. And then I want you to think about all the people who touched you and all the people who you have touched in said garment. So maybe it's just a garment, or to me, it's a system, a social network, a diary, a novel. I've seen these garments as these like containers of narratives that we carry with us. We think about the body having cellular memory, but we often don't consider the materials around us as having the same level of memory. My work as an artist involves kind of working with this intersection of language and textiles as language, language as textiles, and thinking about them as containers of stories, containers of narratives that have been either untold or that have been sort of impregnated over time. The word for textile actually is imbued with the word for text. Text actually comes from the Latin for textiles, so they've been historically sort of connected and linked. Through a research-based approach, I uncover historical and contemporary ways in which labor, so manual, ideological, emotional, codes materials with memory and the story performed by those who encounter it. And I mention skin because bodies are also coded with stories that live beneath our skins. I've often been disappointed by language and this desire to find a single word or a single box. It's been kind of an interesting experience being here because I find that people don't even ask me where I'm from. They just kind of automatically think that I'm American. It's quite a distinct accent, and so there's a different narrative to it. And often I have to sort of justify, I start by apologizing usually when people say I'm American, but then I move on to explaining that I'm actually French and, asking them how much time they have. So my ancestors were Bedouins converted to Judaism, so we have a sort of a long line of people who've sort of like told their stories through textiles. In my own family, it was through sewing and through touching garments. So garments were this like intersection of how we told our stories as a family and to our children. So I started with this piece because because I'm so close to garments, I started taking apart garments and weaving with garments. So I thought, if they had all of this sort of imbued narrative, how could I construct a surface that actually contained the garment? So here you can see it's a 7-piece weaving made with a menswear shirt. I think I was also curious about what it would mean for a garment to swear at you, and how I think something that is generally viewed as a submissive object can actually have agency. So thinking about this kind of this garment that's meant to sort of efface the individual, how it could actually be transformed into something that spoke very loudly. And then of course, sort of working with this intersection of text and textile, I've also worked with making artist books and actually using the textile as a kind of print that can actually speak. Even if it doesn't say anything, it seems to kind of have this own language of the different pressure points or the different sort of knots or moments in which it sort of is pressed further against the plate. And then I also worked with deconstructing garments and kind of thinking about what it would mean if the garments that we wore had their own voice, and what would they say to us. So this is the most recent installation that I've worked on. It was a 9-month weaving installation, and I was doing research in the archives of the Holocaust Museum, and just sort of also curious about my own family history. And I discovered in their files that the blue and white stripes that were attributed to Holocaust prisoners actually were inspired by a line in the Old Testament that dictates that one shall not mix two materials in one garment. And it was poorly translated in the 10th century into two colors in one garment. So it ended up being attributed to prisoners. So it was banned from the clergy in the 10th century and then attributed to prisoners and sort of all other outcasts of society. So striped garments became the symbol of the outsider all the way up until Holocaust prisoners. And so I spelled out the phrase on these weavings and sort of displayed them in the space. And it was really, I was really curious about what it would mean for sort of a forgotten text to be sort of brought back to light, and how I could redisplay it and also show how one text historically can have such ripple effects across time. And then I think this is something that I've been working on here as well. So I also work with paper and writing on paper and then spinning paper. So this is actually made from spun paper with text that's been written on it. So the text literally becomes textile. And I sort of chose these different phrases that I think a lot of people are afraid to say out loud. I often look at sort of different confessional websites or online where people I think are more comfortable with saying what they would really want, and sort of weave those intimate messages into weavings. And then this is kind of the body of work I think that I was building on tonight. I've been working with labor performances, so thinking about how my action is not just something that yields a product where the action is sort of effaced, but actually treating the action as the work. So this is a work where I embroidered a shirt, a menswear shirt, and then I sort of undid the text that was embroidered on my back and wove it. And the text that was on my back was actually the text for North African and for Jew. It was sort of a slang term that was embroidered on my back, and then it was slowly undone and then woven into a weaving. So it's been kind of interesting for me to think about sort of moving and movement as kind of the subject of the work, and how labor and sort of like processing becomes the actual object, and not just like a finished product in which the labor is actually effaced or is meant to be invisible. I think in many ways, in the ways in which sort of history is written by a lot of people who I think have been forgotten, or at least it sort of serves those who have written it. And then over time, the piece was actually re-exhibited. It was exhibited in a Catholic church, which was like quite interesting, I think, as far as thinking about a piece and labor sort of living beyond the actual finished work. So I'm hoping to sort of play more with that as I do more labor performances. So yeah, so tonight I also just wanted to quickly say the work was actually undoing a knitted sweater, which I think I broke a lot of knitters' hearts out there. Yeah. But and reweaving a knitted sweater on my body into a contract. So the format that I was weaving on was 8.5 by 14. So thinking about how bodies actually perform contracts, and how we sign contracts and we have signatures that are supposed to represent bodies, but that are not actually, I think, acknowledged as bodies, but more abstract representations of bodies. So, yeah, thank you.